In public, Hugh Jackman always seemed like the last man anyone would expect to become the face of a heartbreaking family split. For years, he and Deborra-Lee Furness were held up as one of Hollywood's rare success stories. A couple who survived fame, distance, endless rumors, and the kind of spotlight that destroys far stronger relationships. They looked steady. They looked loyal. They looked untouchable. And maybe that is exactly why the collapse of their marriage hit people so hard. It was not just another celebrity breakup. It felt like the end of something people wanted to believe was real. But what made the story even more unsettling was not only the divorce itself, it was the silence around it. A silence so heavy that every photo, every public appearance, every missing statement began to feel louder than words. And in the middle of that silence stood the two people who had spent most of their lives shielded from the public eye, Hugh Jackman's children. Especially Oscar, the son who had grown up watching his parents become symbols of strength, only to see the image crack in front of the world. When Hugh and Deborra-Lee first announced their separation, the message sounded calm, respectful, almost graceful. It spoke of gratitude, shared years, and a new chapter. No bitterness, no public war, no ugly accusations. On the surface, it was exactly the kind of statement fans expected from a couple so careful with their image. But the more time passed, the more that polished goodbye began to feel incomplete, because the public did not stop asking questions. If this was truly peaceful, why did the atmosphere around the family feel so tense? Why did every update seem colder than the last? Why did people close to the story begin hinting that the truth was far more painful than the official version suggested? That is where Oscar's silence became part of the mystery. Oscar Jackman was never a child raised for the spotlight. Hugh and Deborra-Lee worked hard to protect both of their children from the chaos that comes with fame. They did not turn their family into a reality show. They did not parade intimate moments for headlines. They let their children grow up away from the noise. And for a long time, that decision made their family seem even more admirable. They looked private because they were healthy. They looked grounded because they were genuine. That was the impression. That was the story people believed. So when the marriage began to unravel, the absence of Oscar's voice felt deeply significant. Not because he owed the world a statement. He did not. But because in Hollywood, silence from grown children during a family collapse often tells its own story. It can mean loyalty. It can mean shock. It can mean pain, too complicated to put into words. And when the parents at the center of it all are global celebrities, that silence becomes almost impossible for the public to ignore. The hardest part is that divorce does not just end a relationship between husband and wife. It shakes the entire structure of a family. It forces children, even adult children, to re-examine memories they once thought were solid. Every holiday, every family trip, every smiling red carpet photo begins to look different in hindsight. People start asking themselves questions they never wanted to ask. Was the happiness real? How long had things been broken? Who knew first? Who suffered quietly? Who pretended the longest? Those are brutal questions for any family. They are even more brutal when the whole world is watching. And that may be why this story keeps haunting so many fans. Hugh Jackman was not just a movie star. He was one of the few stars whose personal life seemed to support his public image. On screen, he could be intense, charming, wounded, and loyal. Off-screen, he appeared disciplined, devoted, and deeply family-centered. For decades, that image held. So when the marriage ended, it did not just damage a relationship, it damaged a myth. And whenever a myth collapses, people start looking to the children for clues. Not because it is fair, but because children often carry the truth that adults try hardest to hide. Now, with the family no longer able to hold the same united front, even the smallest sign from Oscar feels meaningful. A look, a public appearance, a decision to stay quiet, a choice not to defend, not to explain, not to perform healing for the cameras. Sometimes the most powerful thing a son can do in the middle of a public family fracture is refuse to turn his pain into content. And sometimes that refusal says more than any interview ever could. Because maybe this is not a story about one dramatic quote or one explosive confession. Maybe it is something sadder than that. Maybe it is the story of a family that spent years protecting its private world, only to watch that world break apart so publicly that even silence started sounding like heartbreak. And if that is true, then Oscar Jackman's silence is not empty at all. It is the first real clue that behind the polished headlines and carefully chosen statements, this divorce may have hurt far more than anyone was ready to admit. If there is one thing Hollywood knows how to do, it is protect appearances until the very last possible moment. Smiles stay polished, interviews stay careful, and family photos continue to send one message even when real life is already slipping apart behind the scenes. That is why so many people now look back at Hugh Jackman and Deborra-Lee Furness with a different kind of curiosity. Not because they want to destroy what the couple once had, but because they are trying to understand when the distance truly began. And more importantly, how much of that quiet collapse was felt inside the home long before the world ever heard a word about it. For children, that moment always comes earlier than outsiders realize. Long before fans notice a missing anniversary post or a colder public appearance, children often feel the shift in a house. The rhythm changes, conversations shorten, the warmth becomes more formal. Small traditions begin to disappear, not with a dramatic fight, but with hesitation. That is what makes celebrity divorces so deceptive from the outside. The public waits for one big scandal, one explosive revelation, one undeniable moment. But for the family living through it, the pain usually arrives slowly. It creeps in. It changes the emotional climate of everyday life until the home no longer feels like the same place, even before anyone says the word separation out loud. If Oscar Jackman experienced any of that, it would explain why his silence feels less like mystery and more like emotional self-protection. Because what does a son say when two parents who once seemed inseparable suddenly become the center of a worldwide breakup narrative? What words could possibly capture that kind of confusion without betraying one side or the other? In families like this, silence is not always avoidance. Sometimes, silence is the last form of loyalty left. Speak too soon, and people accuse you of choosing sides. Stay quiet, and they assume you know something terrible. Either way, the child becomes part of the spectacle. And for someone raised away from the public spotlight, that pressure can feel unbearable. That is where this story starts to feel much heavier than a normal celebrity headline, because Hugh and Deborra-Lee did not build their family life like a publicity machine. They built it like a shelter. They seemed to believe that privacy was not just a preference, but a form of protection. Their children were not supposed to become public interpreters of their parents' pain. They were not supposed to stand in front of cameras and explain what broke, who changed, or why things could not be repaired. Yet once the marriage fell apart, that protection weakened instantly. Suddenly, every member of the family was being watched through the same harsh lens. And that changes everything. Once public curiosity enters a private family crisis, even ordinary choices start looking loaded with meaning. If Oscar is seen with one parent, people speculate. If he is not seen at all, people speculate even more. If he posts nothing, it becomes a story. If he says something small, it gets turned into a headline far larger than he ever intended. It is a trap many celebrity children know too well. The world claims to want honesty, but what it often wants is confirmation of its own suspicions. And in a divorce surrounded by whispers, timing, and growing emotional tension, the pressure on a son like Oscar becomes impossible to ignore. What makes this even sadder is the timing of adulthood. People often assume that older children handle divorce better because they are grown, more mature, more emotionally developed. But in some ways, adult children can suffer differently. They are old enough to understand the emotional complexity, old enough to notice contradictions, old enough to remember years of family history in painful detail. They can compare the past to the present. They can see what has been lost. And unlike young children, they are often expected to carry themselves with composure, even when the grief is just as real. That may be why the idea of Oscar finally breaking his silence has such emotional power. Whether he says a great deal or very little, people are not just waiting for gossip. They are waiting for a sign of what this divorce actually did to the family behind closed doors, because no matter how controlled the official statements may be, the children often reveal what the parents cannot. Not always with words, but with distance, restraint, and the quiet sadness of someone who has seen too much to pretend everything is fine. And maybe that is the most painful part of all. For years, Hugh Jackman's image was built on the idea of steadiness. He was talented, disciplined, charismatic, and above all, deeply grounded by family. That image did not feel fake. It felt earned. Which means this divorce is not shocking simply because a marriage ended. It is shocking because it forces people to confront the possibility that even the most admired family stories can fracture in silence while the world applauds from the outside. So when people say Oscar's silence speaks volumes, they may be right. Not because silence proves scandal, not because it confirms every rumor, but because silence this deep usually comes from somewhere real, somewhere wounded, somewhere caught between love for both parents and the painful knowledge that life will never look the same again. And if that silence ever does break, it may not come as anger, it may not come as accusation, it may come as something quieter and far more devastating. A simple truth from a son who watched his family's strongest image fall apart and learned, too early, that some heartbreak does not arrive with shouting, it arrives with stillness. What makes this story linger is not just the divorce itself, but the uncomfortable possibility that the family may have been carrying this weight for far longer than anyone knew. Public statements can announce a separation in one moment, but emotional separation often begins months or even years earlier. That is the part fans rarely see, the long, quiet period before the headline. The careful routines, the polite distance, the attempt to preserve normal life while something essential is already slipping away. And for a son like Oscar, that kind of slow unraveling may have been the hardest part of all. Because when a family breaks suddenly, there is at least a moment everyone can point to, one day before, one day after. But when a family breaks slowly, the pain becomes harder to name. You do not know when to start grieving, because nothing ends all at once. You just begin noticing absences, a different tone, a missing ease, a feeling that the room has changed even though all the furniture is still there. That kind of heartbreak is especially cruel because it forces the children to live inside uncertainty while the adults are still deciding what story to tell the world. And in families built on love, respect, and years of shared identity, that uncertainty can feel almost surreal. For decades, Hugh Jackman and Deborra-Lee Furness were more than just husband and wife in the public imagination. They represented endurance. They were the couple people pointed to when they wanted proof that fame did not have to destroy loyalty. Their marriage was not marketed like a fantasy, but it quietly became one anyway. Fans saw something rare in them: stability, maturity, a sense that real commitment could survive in an industry where almost nothing lasts. That is why the divorce felt bigger than a private split. It felt like the collapse of a promise. And when a promise like that breaks, the children are left standing in the space between public myth and private truth. That is where Oscar's position becomes especially painful to imagine. He is not just watching two parents separate. He is also watching the outside world reinterpret his family in real time. The same marriage once praised as inspiring is now being dissected for warning signs. The same photos once seen as evidence of devotion are being re-examined for distance, strain, or hidden sadness. Every memory becomes vulnerable to revision. Every good year becomes a question. Were they happy then? Was the pain already there? Did the children know before everyone else did? Those questions can be deeply intrusive. But once a famous family enters the divorce cycle, they become almost impossible to avoid. And maybe that is why so many grown children of famous parents choose restraint over explanation. They understand that once they speak, they lose control of the meaning. A thoughtful comment becomes a sensational headline. A tender memory becomes evidence in an argument they never asked to join. Even a simple expression of love for both parents can be twisted into proof of division, loyalty, or resentment. So, they learn the hardest lesson of all. In public family crises, silence is sometimes the only safe language left. But silence has a cost. It leaves room for projection. It leaves strangers to fill in the blanks with their own theories. It forces the quietest people in the story to carry the heaviest emotional burden, while others debate what happened as if it were just another entertainment cycle. And in Oscar's case, that burden may be even heavier because he grew up in a home that seemed to value dignity above spectacle. If you are raised to protect family privacy, then speaking out can feel like betrayal. But staying silent when everyone demands answers can feel like suffocation. There is no easy role for a son in that kind of storm. What also makes this subject so emotional is the age at which these family changes happen. By adulthood, a child has already built an internal map of what family means. Certain people belong together in your mind, not because they are perfect, but because they are part of the emotional architecture of your life. Their routines shape yours. Their bond becomes the background music of your identity. When that bond breaks, it can shake more than memories. It can unsettle the way you understand stability itself. Suddenly, the thing that looked strongest is no longer permanent. The people who taught you endurance are now teaching you, whether they mean to or not, that even the longest chapters can still end. That is a brutal realization. Not dramatic, not loud, just deeply, quietly brutal. And perhaps that is why the public keeps circling back to Oscar. Not because he is a celebrity in the usual sense, but because he represents the emotional center people cannot access directly. Hugh can release statements. Deborra-Lee can be quoted. Sources can whisper. Friends can comment. But the children often hold the part of the story no one else can fully tell. They know what the house felt like. They know which changes happened before the public noticed. They know what was lost that never makes it into official language. Even if they never say it, people sense that truth lives there. So the idea of Oscar breaking his silence carries a weight that goes far beyond gossip. It suggests the possibility of hearing from the one person who did not help build the public image, but still had to live inside its collapse. And that is why this story remains so haunting. Because when the children of a seemingly unshakable marriage go quiet, the silence does not feel empty. It feels like grief protecting itself. And sometimes, that is the clearest sign that the real damage happened far away from the cameras, long before the world understood that anything was wrong. By the time a family story reaches the public, it has usually already been lived through in private 100 different ways. There have been quiet dinners, awkward pauses, unreadable glances, and long stretches of emotional distance that no camera could ever capture. That is why the public version of a divorce is almost never the full version. It is a polished summary of something far messier, far sadder, and far more human. And in the case of Hugh Jackman and Deborra-Lee Furness, that difference between the public story and the private emotional reality may be exactly what makes the silence around Oscar feel so powerful. Because when a son stays quiet during a family rupture this visible, people naturally begin to wonder what the silence is protecting. Maybe it is protecting memories. Maybe it is protecting one parent from being hurt further. Maybe it is protecting himself from being forced into a role he never wanted. Or maybe it is protecting the last fragile pieces of a family identity that once felt permanent and now feels impossible to hold together. For someone like Oscar, speaking publicly would not just mean commenting on a divorce. It would mean stepping into a narrative that has already taken on a life of its own. A narrative built from headlines, speculation, and public hunger for details that do not belong to strangers. That is the cruelty of celebrity family breakdowns. The people closest to the pain are often the least able to express it freely. Every word carries consequences. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every public move gets interpreted through a lens of tension. And the more beloved the couple once was, the harsher that lens becomes. Hugh and Deborra-Lee were not a pair people casually followed. They were one of those rare couples audiences emotionally invested in. People wanted them to last because they symbolized something comforting. They made long-term devotion look possible in an industry built on instability. So, when that image shattered, disappointment quickly turned into obsession. Fans were not just reacting to a breakup. They were reacting to the loss of a story they had trusted. And children always feel the shock of that collapse differently. Unlike the public, they are not grieving an image. They are grieving the emotional structure of their real lives. They are dealing with the uncomfortable transition from one version of home to another. The routines change. The emotional lines shift. Conversations that once felt natural become careful. Family gatherings take on a different shape. Even the simplest future plans are touched by what has been broken. It is not just about where people live or what statements get released. It is about the invisible things that make a family feel like itself. When those things are disturbed, the loss runs deeper than outsiders often understand. That may be why the silence around Oscar feels so heavy. Not dramatic, not explosive, but heavy. It suggests someone carrying more than he wants to display. It suggests a young man, unwilling to turn family pain into public theater. And in an era where so many people rush to post, react, and frame their own version of events, that kind of restraint can feel almost heartbreaking on its own. Because sometimes, silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it is discipline. Sometimes it is sadness, with nowhere safe to go. There is also something else people rarely talk about when marriages like this end. Children do not just lose the family they knew in the present. They lose the certainty of the past. Once the separation becomes real, old memories start changing shape. Moments that once seemed simple now feel layered. A holiday photo carries new questions. A loving public appearance begins to look fragile in hindsight. A family milestone becomes tinged with the knowledge of what was coming. That is one of the most painful consequences of a slow public divorce. It reaches backward as much as it reaches forward. It rewrites the meaning of things that used to feel secure. For a son like Oscar, that process may be happening quietly and all at once. He may be trying to hold on to the truth that both of his parents loved him, while also confronting the reality that love between parents is not always enough to keep a marriage alive. He may be trying to preserve respect for their shared history, while privately absorbing the emotional cost of its ending. He may be learning one of adulthood's harshest lessons, that people can be good, caring, devoted in many ways, and still fail to save the life they built together. That lesson does not arrive as scandal. It arrives as disillusionment. And disillusionment is often much harder to talk about than anger. That is why the idea of Oscar breaking his silence has become so emotionally charged. People imagine one dramatic moment, one revealing statement, one final clue that explains everything. But real family pain rarely arrives with perfect clarity. If he ever does speak, it may not sound like accusation at all. It may sound conflicted, careful, protective, and quietly wounded. It may sound like someone trying to honor both parents while also acknowledging that something profound has changed forever. And in many ways, that would be even sadder than any explosive claim. Because the deepest heartbreak in stories like this is rarely betrayal alone. It is the sight of decent people failing to preserve something that once seemed unbreakable. It is the collapse of emotional certainty. It is the realization that even a family built on years of love and loyalty can still come apart in a way no one fully knows how to explain. That is the kind of truth children often carry in silence, not because they have nothing to say, but because what they have to say cannot fix what has already been lost. And maybe that is the real reason this story continues to haunt people. Not because the public is desperate for gossip, but because Oscar's silence feels like the emotional proof that this was never just another celebrity split. It was a fracture inside a family that had spent years convincing the world, and perhaps themselves, that they were stronger than most. When that kind of family breaks, the loudest thing in the room is often the one person who says nothing at all. There is a particular kind of sadness that comes when a family does not explode in public, but slowly drifts apart behind closed doors, while the world still believes everything is intact. It is not the loud heartbreak of scandal, it is the quiet heartbreak of realization. The moment when the people inside the home understand that something once solid is no longer holding, even if no one outside can see it yet. That is the kind of sadness many people now suspect may have surrounded Hugh Jackman, Deborra-Lee Furness, and their children long before the headlines caught up. And if that is true, then Oscar's silence begins to feel less like mystery and more like the natural response of someone who has been carrying emotional truth for a long time. Because silence often begins long before the public ever notices it. It begins when family members stop saying what they really feel, because they are trying to keep peace alive. It begins when difficult conversations are delayed, in the hope that time will somehow repair what honesty might expose. It begins when everyone in the house senses that something is changing, but no one wants to be the first to give the change a name. In families that have been together for decades, that silence can become almost sacred. People protect it because they think they are protecting one another. But over time, that same silence can become its own kind of burden. It fills the rooms. It enters ordinary moments. It teaches everyone how to smile while carrying an ache they cannot easily explain. If Oscar lived through that, then his public quiet makes perfect emotional sense. The world sees an adult son who has not stepped forward dramatically. But what the world may really be seeing is someone who already spent years living through the unspoken version of this story. Someone who learned that not every wound can be described without deepening it. Someone who understands that once family pain is spoken into the public air, it stops belonging to the family alone. It becomes material. It becomes narrative. It becomes something strangers reshape into entertainment. For a person raised in a home that valued privacy, that transformation may feel unbearable. Some people speak to take control. Others stay quiet because they know control is already gone. That is part of what makes this situation so devastating. There may be no villain simple enough to satisfy the public. No single sentence that explains why a marriage of this length and history finally gave way. No perfect quote from a son that ties together years of love, disappointment, loyalty, confusion, and grief. Real family endings are rarely clean like that. They are usually made of contradictions. You can love both parents and still feel shattered. You can respect their history and still resent what has changed. You can understand that adults are imperfect and still mourn the loss of what you thought would last forever. And that kind of emotional contradiction is incredibly hard to speak aloud. Maybe that is why people keep projecting so much onto Oscar. They sense that the deepest truth of the story does not live in the official statements. It lives in the emotional aftershocks. It lives in the people who did not choose the spotlight, but still had to absorb the consequences of what happened. It lives in the son who grew up under the image of a lasting marriage, and now has to navigate the painful gap between what the world admired and what the family became. That gap is where so much hidden grief lives. It is also where silence often becomes the most honest response available. There is another layer to this that makes the whole story even sadder. When a famous couple separates after so many years, the public naturally focuses on the end. But for the children, the end is only one part of the pain. The larger pain is often the reorganization of everything that follows. The future no longer looks the same. Celebrations feel different. Ordinary life must be rebuilt around a new emotional reality. Family traditions that once felt automatic now require negotiation. Even love itself can begin to feel more fragile, not because it was false, but because it proved unable to protect what mattered most. That can change a person deeply. A son in that position may begin to view relationships with a different kind of caution. He may carry questions he never had before. He may find himself re-examining not only his parents, but the very idea of permanence. That is one of the cruelest effects of divorce on adult children. It does not just alter their family, it can alter the way they imagine trust, commitment, and emotional safety in their own lives. And when the parents involved were once held up as a model of endurance, that internal shift can feel even more profound. The fall is longer when the image was higher. So when people wonder whether Oscar will ever truly break his silence, perhaps they are asking the wrong question. The more revealing question may be this: what has his silence already told us? It has told us that not every family wound wants to be turned into a statement. It has told us that dignity can sometimes look like absence. It has told us that grief does not always announce itself with tears or public anger. Sometimes grief looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like staying away from the noise, because the noise cannot possibly understand what has been lost. And maybe, in a strange way, that is the most heartbreaking detail of all. For years, Hugh Jackman and Deborra-Lee seemed to embody stability in a world that rarely offers it. Their family appeared grounded, protective, deeply bonded. Whether that image was partly true or only partly sustainable no longer matters as much as the damage left behind by its collapse. Because once a family story like that breaks open, everyone touched by it has to live with the fragments. The parents carry history. The public carries disappointment. But the children carry something more intimate. They carry the before and after. They remember what it felt like when the family still seemed whole, and they must somehow learn how to live with what remains when that wholeness is gone. That is not a tabloid detail. That is the human center of the story. And perhaps that is why Oscar's silence continues to feel so powerful. Not because it confirms the worst rumors, not because it solves the mystery, but because it reminds us that beneath every polished headline about divorce, there are private emotional ruins no outsider can fully measure. A son does not need to say much for that truth to be felt. Sometimes the silence itself is the testimony. Sometimes it is the clearest sign that the pain was real, the loss was deep, and the family at the center of it will never be exactly the same again. What makes family silence so haunting is that it often contains two opposite truths at once. On one side, it can be an act of love. On the other, it can be evidence of pain too deep to safely touch. That is why the silence around Oscar Jackman has continued to draw so much attention. People want to treat it like a missing piece of gossip, but it may actually be something far more serious than that. It may be the sound of a son trying to survive the emotional collapse of a family story that once seemed too strong to fail. And perhaps that is what makes this story so difficult to shake. When the world looks at a celebrity divorce, it usually wants a clear narrative. It wants a timeline, a cause, a betrayal, a turning point, and a reaction dramatic enough to make sense of the whole thing. But families do not fall apart in neat sequences. Even when the legal process is clear, the emotional process rarely is. Feelings overlap, loyalties conflict. Grief mixes with anger, and compassion mixes with disappointment. Children, especially adult children, are often left holding all of those contradictions at once. They are expected to understand what happened without ever being fully protected from its consequences. And that burden can be crushing in ways no headline is capable of capturing. For Oscar, the hardest part may not be choosing what to say. It may be knowing that no words could possibly match the complexity of what was lost. How do you explain the end of a marriage that shaped your entire understanding of family? How do you talk about two parents who may both be good, both be wounded, both be flawed, and both be impossible to fully defend in the eyes of the public. How do you protect your own heart when the world keeps asking for interpretation? The deeper the history, the harder it becomes. Long marriages do not just leave behind memories. They leave behind emotional architecture. Their ending changes how children think about the past, the present, and their own future all at once. That is why this silence feels less like absence and more like aftermath. There is often a moment in family breakdowns when the children realize that the adults are no longer carrying the whole emotional weight. Even without meaning to, the parents begin releasing some of that burden into the lives of the people around them. The children become witnesses. They become holders of tension. They become the quiet ones, adjusting to new realities, while everyone else focuses on the official story. And because they love both sides, they often have nowhere safe to place their grief. They cannot fully blame. They cannot fully withdraw. They cannot fully fix anything. They simply endure. And endurance, when it lasts too long, can start to resemble silence from the outside. That may be exactly what people are sensing in Oscar. Not scandal, not performance, not even deliberate mystery, just endurance. The kind of endurance that comes from watching something foundational weaken over time and understanding that once it breaks, no public explanation will restore what it used to be. That is one of the loneliest emotional positions a child can occupy. You are close enough to feel the damage, but distant enough to know it does not belong to you to publicly define. You are grieving something real while the world debates something simplified. And no matter what you say, some part of the truth will remain trapped inside you because family pain is never fully transferable into language. There is also a cruel irony here. The more dignified a family has been in public, the more shocking its fracture becomes when it finally shows. Hugh Jackman and Deborra-Lee did not build their reputation through chaos. They built it through steadiness. That is what made people admire them. That is what made the marriage feel meaningful beyond celebrity culture. So when that image collapsed, it did not create ordinary curiosity. It created emotional disbelief. People did not just ask what happened, they asked how something this solid could fail. And once that question takes hold, the children inevitably become symbolic in the public imagination. They are seen as the keepers of what really happened, even when they never asked for that role. That is an unfair burden, but it is a real one. And maybe that is why the phrase "breaks silence" feels so loaded in stories like this. It suggests revelation. It suggests closure. It suggests that one statement could finally unlock the truth. But family truth is rarely that generous. If Oscar ever speaks openly, what he offers may not be a revelation at all. It may be something far quieter. A glimpse of sadness, a careful defense of both parents, an acknowledgement that things changed in ways that hurt more than outsiders understand. Maybe even a refusal to go further. And strangely, that kind of restraint might reveal more than any dramatic accusation ever could. Because the saddest version of this story is not that there was one shocking moment that destroyed everything. The saddest version is that the family may have loved each other deeply and still been unable to preserve the life they built. That kind of ending leaves very little room for simple anger. It leaves behind grief, ambiguity, memory, and the quiet pain of accepting that some things can end without anyone ever being able to explain them in a way that feels complete. Children often carry that pain more privately than anyone realizes, because they are not only losing a family structure, they are losing a version of certainty they may have trusted all their lives. And once that certainty is gone, silence can become its own form of mourning. Maybe that is what makes Oscar's silence feel so different from ordinary celebrity family drama. It does not feel strategic. It feels protective. It feels like the behavior of someone who understands that speaking publicly might satisfy curiosity, but it would not heal what has already been broken. It would not restore the home that existed before. It would not make old memories simple again. It would not return the emotional safety that a long marriage once represented. All it would do is turn private hurt into public material. And for some people, that price is simply too high. So as the world keeps waiting for the sun to say something definitive, perhaps the truth has already been standing in front of everyone the whole time. The silence itself is the message. It tells us this divorce did not just end a marriage. It reshaped a family in ways too intimate, too painful, and too complicated to reduce to one quote. And if Oscar Jackman ever does break that silence, the most heartbreaking thing he may reveal is not who was right or wrong, but how deeply the ending changed everyone who had to live inside it. In the end, the most painful family stories are rarely the ones filled with the loudest scandal. They are the ones filled with the most silence. The ones where people keep trying to protect each other even as everything they built begins to come apart. The ones where love may still exist, but no longer in a form strong enough to keep the family life they once knew alive. That is why this story continues to hit such a deep nerve. It is not only about Hugh Jackman, Deborra-Lee Furness, or the public fascination with their divorce. It is about what happens to the children when a family that once seemed unshakable quietly becomes something else. And by now, that may be the clearest truth of all. Oscar Jackman's silence has become meaningful precisely because it refuses to behave like entertainment. In a culture where every family fracture is expected to produce instant reactions, emotional statements, and neatly packaged narratives, his quiet has felt almost unsettling. Not because it confirms every dark theory, but because it resists the public's hunger to turn pain into content. It reminds people that some stories are still too raw to explain. Some losses are still unfolding long after the headlines begin to fade. And some children, even as adults, are still trying to understand what they have lost before they can even begin to describe it. That is what makes the silence feel human. It is easy to forget that when a marriage ends after so many years, the children are not just reacting to one event, they are reacting to a total emotional rearrangement. The old family map no longer works the same way. The future divides into separate paths. The sense of who belongs where, who shows up with whom, who carries which traditions, all begins to shift. Even when everyone stays respectful, that shift can feel like a kind of private earthquake. Nothing looks completely destroyed from the outside, but the ground underneath has changed forever. And once that happens, every member of the family has to find a new balance, whether they are ready or not. For a son like Oscar, that adjustment may be happening in the most painful possible way, quietly, privately, under the eyes of a world that keeps searching his silence for clues. But maybe the reason people keep searching is because they recognize something real in it. Almost everyone, famous or not, understands what it means to watch a family change in ways no one wanted. Almost everyone understands the ache of realizing that adults can love each other and still fail to stay together. Almost everyone understands the strange grief of looking back at old memories and wondering what was already beginning to break. That is why this story reaches beyond celebrity. It taps into something deeply universal, the fear that what feels safest can still fall apart, the fear that the strongest-looking families may carry hidden pain, the fear that by the time the truth becomes public, the real heartbreak has already been living inside the home for a very long time. And children often know that before anyone else. That is why Oscar's silence may be the most revealing part of the entire story. Not because silence tells us every detail, but because it tells us there are details too heavy, too tender, or too complicated to share carelessly. It tells us that whatever happened inside this family cannot be reduced to gossip alone. It tells us that real emotional damage may exist behind the polished language of mutual respect and public dignity. And most of all, it tells us that when a son chooses not to perform his pain for the world, that choice itself deserves to be understood, not exploited. If he ever speaks, it may not bring the kind of closure people imagine. It may not answer every question. It may not satisfy the drama the internet expects. In fact, it may only deepen the sadness. Because the most honest version of a story like this would probably sound conflicted. It would probably contain love, disappointment, restraint, grief, and loyalty all at once. It would sound like someone trying to protect both parents, while also admitting that the life they created together could not survive. And that kind of truth is far more heartbreaking than scandal, because it leaves no easy place to put the blame. Maybe that is the final lesson hiding inside all of this. The collapse of a family is not always loud. Sometimes it happens with grace on the surface and grief underneath. Sometimes the public sees a calm announcement, while the people closest to it are quietly learning how to live with a new emotional reality. Sometimes the child at the center of the silence is not withholding a secret. He is simply carrying a pain that language cannot improve. And maybe that is why the story of Oscar Jackman breaking his silence has captured so much attention in the first place. Not because people only want the quote, but because deep down, they know silence like this usually comes from somewhere true, somewhere wounded, somewhere still trying to hold together the last private pieces of a family that once meant everything. In the end, perhaps the most devastating thing is not what Oscar has said. It is what he has not said. The refusal to turn heartbreak into spectacle. The refusal to simplify something that changed his family forever. The refusal to speak before he is ready? Or maybe the refusal to speak at all. In a world that confuses exposure with honesty, that silence feels almost sacred. And that may be the clearest sign that this divorce was never just another headline. It was the breaking of a family story that once looked indestructible. And the quiet left behind may be the only honest way to describe just how much it hurt.